The morning sun cast long shadows across the small diner in Cedar Falls, Iowa, as Marcus Thompson wiped down tables with the same precision he had once used to clean his rifle. At 62, the former Marine still carried himself with military bearing, though his graying hair and weathered hands told the story of decades that had passed since his service in Vietnam. The Purple Heart Diner had become his sanctuary, a place where he could serve others the way he had once served his country. Marcus had opened the diner 15 years ago with his military pension and savings, naming it after the medal he had received after taking shrapnel in his leg during the Tet Offensive. The walls were decorated with photos of local veterans from various conflicts, creating a shrine to service that drew both military families and civilians who appreciated good food and honest conversation. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Marcus unlocked the doors and prepared for another day of feeding his community. The breakfast rush was in full swing when the bell above the door chimed, announcing another customer. Marcus looked up from the grill where he was preparing eggs and bacon for table 4. A man entered slowly, using a walking stick to support his slight frame. He appeared to be roughly the same age as Marcus, with silver hair neatly combed and clothes that, while simple, were clean and pressed. What caught Marcus's attention immediately was not the man's appearance, but something indefinable about the way he moved and observed his surroundings. The stranger paused just inside the doorway, scanning the restaurant with eyes that seemed to take in every detail. His gaze lingered on the veterans' photos, reading each nameplate with careful attention. Marcus noticed how the man's fingers tightened slightly on his walking stick when he saw a particular section of the wall dedicated to Vietnam veterans. There was something familiar about the way the stranger carried himself, a bearing that Marcus recognized from his own reflection. Sarah, the morning waitress, approached the newcomer with her usual warm smile. She was a local college student who had been working at the diner for 2 years, and Marcus had grown fond of her genuine kindness toward the older customers who frequently visited. Sarah guided the man to a small table near the window, where the morning light illuminated his weathered features. As she handed him a menu, Marcus caught a glimpse of a small scar on the man's left hand, the kind that came from old wounds. The breakfast crowd was typical for a Tuesday morning. There was Bob Patterson, a Korean War veteran who came in every day at 7:30 for coffee and wheat toast. At the corner booth sat the Johnson family, regulars who always ordered the same thing before dropping their kids at school. Near the counter, 3 retirees debated local politics over their eggs and hash browns. The atmosphere was comfortable and familiar, filled with the sounds of conversation, clinking silverware, and the gentle sizzle of the grill. Marcus continued cooking while keeping an eye on the new customer. The man studied the menu carefully, then looked around the restaurant again. His attention returned repeatedly to the wall of veteran photos, particularly those from the Vietnam era. When Sarah returned to take his order, Marcus was close enough to overhear the conversation. The stranger's voice was quiet but clear, with a slight accent that Marcus couldn't quite place. "I would like coffee, black, and perhaps some eggs," the man said. "Over easy, if possible, with some toast." Sarah smiled and jotted down the order. "Of course. And welcome to the Purple Heart Diner. I haven't seen you here before." The man nodded politely. "I am visiting the area. This seems like a very nice place." As Sarah walked away, Marcus noticed how the stranger continued to study the photographs on the walls. His expression was thoughtful, almost melancholy, as he examined each image. When his gaze fell on a particular photo of Marcus in his Marine dress uniform from 1969, the man's attention lingered longer than on the others. Marcus felt an odd sensation, as if he were being evaluated by someone who understood military service from personal experience. The morning continued with its usual rhythm. Marcus prepared the stranger's breakfast with the same care he gave every meal, making sure the eggs were perfectly cooked and the toast was golden brown. When Sarah delivered the plate, the man thanked her graciously and began eating slowly, still occasionally glancing at the wall of photographs. His movements were deliberate and careful, suggesting someone who had learned to appreciate simple pleasures. Around 9 o'clock, as the breakfast rush began to thin out, the stranger finished his meal and sat back in his chair. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what appeared to be an old photograph, placing it on the table beside his coffee cup. From across the restaurant, Marcus couldn't make out the details, but he could see that the man was studying the image intently, comparing it to something on the wall. The morning continued with various customers coming and going. The Johnson family finished their breakfast and hurried off to start their day. Bob Patterson lingered over his coffee, reading the local newspaper and occasionally commenting on articles to anyone within earshot. The three retirees at the counter continued their political discussion, their voices rising and falling with the passion of their convictions. Through it all, the stranger remained at his table, nursing his coffee and occasionally glancing at the photograph in his hands. Marcus found himself drawn to the man's quiet dignity. There was something about him that suggested depth of experience, perhaps even hardship overcome with grace. The way he sat, the careful attention he paid to his surroundings, the respectful manner in which he had spoken to Sarah, all of these details painted a picture of someone who understood the value of courtesy and consideration. As the clock approached 10 o'clock, the restaurant had quieted significantly. Only a few customers remained, including the stranger who continued his vigil at the window table. Marcus decided to take a short break from the kitchen and walked over to check on him personally. As he approached, the man looked up with alert but friendly eyes. "How was your breakfast?" Marcus asked, noting that the plate had been cleaned completely. The stranger smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "It was excellent, thank you. The eggs were perfect, and the coffee is very good. You run a fine establishment." Marcus appreciated the compliment but found himself curious about something else. "Are you visiting someone in the area?" The man paused for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "In a way, yes. I am reconnecting with some old memories. This town, this area, holds significance for me." Something in the man's tone suggested deeper meaning behind his words. Marcus noticed how his fingers absently traced the edge of the photograph on the table, as if it held particular importance. The image appeared to be old, with the slightly faded quality of pictures taken decades ago. "Well, you're welcome here any time," Marcus said. "We appreciate folks who understand the importance of remembering." The stranger's eyes brightened slightly. "You were military yourself, I assume? The name of your restaurant and the photographs suggest this." Marcus nodded. "Marines, Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. You have the look of someone who's served as well." For a moment, the two men regarded each other with the unspoken understanding that exists between veterans. There was recognition there, the acknowledgement of shared experience even if their specific stories differed. The stranger's expression grew more serious, as if Marcus had touched on something significant. "Yes, I served," the man said quietly. "Though perhaps not in the way you might expect." Before Marcus could ask what he meant by that cryptic response, the bell above the door chimed again. A group of construction workers entered, their voices loud and cheerful as they looked for tables. Marcus excused himself to help seat them, but he found his thoughts returning to the mysterious stranger throughout the morning. When he looked back toward the window table a few minutes later, Marcus saw that the man was holding up the photograph, comparing it to one specific image on the wall. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that the stranger had focused on a particular section of the Vietnam Memorial display. The man's expression was intense, as if he had found exactly what he had been looking for. The construction workers ordered heartily, joking among themselves about their upcoming project. Their energy filled the restaurant with a different kind of atmosphere, one of present-day concerns and immediate pleasures. In contrast, the stranger at the window table seemed to exist in a different time frame, connected to memories and experiences from long ago. As Marcus prepared the workers' orders, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was unfolding at the window table. The stranger's presence had an almost magnetic quality, as if his story was radiating outward even though he hadn't shared any details. There was a weight to him, the kind that comes from carrying important truths. Sarah approached Marcus while he was plating bacon and eggs. "That gentleman by the window asked if he could speak with the owner when you have a moment. He seems really nice, but also like he has something important on his mind." Marcus glanced toward the table and saw that the stranger was indeed waiting patiently, the photograph still in his hands. There was something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, that suggested this conversation would be more significant than casual small talk about the weather or local attractions. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting different shadows through the restaurant windows. The construction workers were deep in their meal, discussing their plans for the day with the easy camaraderie of men who worked well together. Bob Patterson had finally finished his newspaper and was preparing to leave, counting out exact change as he always did. The atmosphere in the diner was comfortable and familiar, yet Marcus sensed that something was about to change. He finished plating the last of the construction workers' orders and wiped his hands on his apron. Walking toward the window table, Marcus noticed how the stranger's attention remained focused on the specific photograph in his hands. As he drew closer, Marcus could see that the image showed several soldiers in combat gear, standing together in what appeared to be a military compound. The faces were young and serious, marked by the gravity of their circumstances. The stranger looked up as Marcus approached, and their eyes met with an intensity that suggested the importance of the moment. There was something in the man's expression that spoke of long-carried burdens and carefully guarded truths. Marcus had seen that look before, in the mirror during his own dark nights of memory and reflection. "You wanted to speak with me?" Marcus said, settling into the chair across from the stranger. The man nodded slowly, placing the photograph face down on the table. "Yes. My name is Nguyen Duc Min. I believe you and I have something very important to discuss." The accent that Marcus had noticed earlier suddenly made perfect sense. The careful way the man had studied the Vietnam photographs, his knowledge of military bearing, the way he seemed to carry all of these details clicked into place with startling clarity. Marcus felt his breath catch slightly as the implications of the introduction settled in his mind. Nguyen continued speaking, his voice steady but carrying emotional undertones. "I have traveled very far to find this place, to find you specifically. That photograph on your wall, the one showing your unit near Khe Sanh, I believe I am in it." Marcus felt the world shift slightly as Nguyen's words settled into his consciousness. The busy sounds of the diner seemed to fade into background noise as he processed what the Vietnamese man had just revealed. His eyes moved from Nguyen's weathered face to the photograph that still lay face down on the table, then to the wall where his own military memories were displayed for all to see. "You were there," Marcus said slowly, not quite a question but a statement seeking confirmation. Nguyen nodded, his fingers moving to turn over the photograph he had been carrying. The image showed a group of North Vietnamese soldiers standing near what appeared to be a captured position. The uniforms were different, the equipment was different, but the faces showed the same mixture of youth and gravity that Marcus recognized from his own wartime photographs. These were soldiers who had seen combat, who understood the weight of their responsibilities. "I was a lieutenant in the People's Army of Vietnam," Nguyen continued, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone speaking in a second language. "My unit was involved in several engagements in the Khe Sanh area during 1969. We encountered your Marines on more than one occasion." The construction workers at the nearby table burst into laughter over some shared joke, but Marcus barely heard them. His mind was racing back through memories he had spent decades trying to either forget or make peace with. The jungle heat, the constant tension, the faces of fellow Marines who had trusted him to lead them through impossible situations. And, somewhere in those memories, the faceless enemy who had been trying to kill him just as he had been trying to kill them. Marcus had always known, intellectually, that the North Vietnamese soldiers were human beings with their own stories, their own reasons for fighting, their own families waiting for them to return home. But they had existed in his memory as abstract threats rather than individuals with names and faces and hopes for the future. Now one of them was sitting across from him in his own restaurant, drinking coffee and speaking with quiet dignity about their shared past. "The engagement near Hill 881, Nguyen said carefully, in late March of 1969. Your unit was advancing toward our positions when the monsoon started. Do you remember?" Marcus remembered. The rain had come down in sheets, turning the red clay soil into treacherous mud that grabbed at their boots with every step. His squad had been pinned down for hours behind a fallen tree, taking sporadic fire from positions they couldn't locate in the reduced visibility. 2 of his men had been wounded that day, and they had been forced to retreat without accomplishing their objective. It had been one of many frustrating, terrifying days that blended together in his memory of that time. We were dug in about 200 meters from your position, Nguyen continued. I remember watching your Marines trying to move up the slope. The rain was so heavy that both sides could barely see each other. My commanding officer gave orders to maintain our positions but avoid unnecessary casualties. We fired over your heads mostly, trying to discourage your advance without causing deaths. This revelation stunned Marcus. He had always assumed that every shot fired in his direction had been aimed with deadly intent. The idea that enemy soldiers had deliberately chosen restraint, even in the middle of combat, challenged his understanding of what had happened during those chaotic months. He found himself studying Nguyen's face, looking for signs of deception but finding only earnest sincerity. Why would you do that? Marcus asked. We were your enemies. Nguyen was quiet for a moment, considering his response. Around them, the normal life of the diner continued. Sarah refilled coffee cups and chatted with customers. The construction workers discussed their project timeline. Bob Patterson finally gathered his things and headed for the door with his usual friendly wave to Marcus. The contrast between the peaceful present and the wartime memories being shared at the window table felt almost surreal. We were young men fighting for what we believed was right, Nguyen finally answered. But we were not monsters. My father had fought against the French, and he taught me that honor in battle meant protecting your own while minimizing harm to others when possible. Not all situations allowed such choices, but when they did. He gestured slightly with his hands. We were soldiers, not killers for the sake of killing. Marcus thought about his own father, who had served in World War II and had shared similar lessons about maintaining humanity even in the midst of warfare. The parallels between their upbringings struck him as both ironic and profound. Here were two men, raised on opposite sides of the world, who had been taught similar values about honor and restraint, yet circumstances had placed them on opposite sides of a brutal conflict. The wounded Marine that day, Nguyen said, pulling another photograph from his jacket. The one with the leg injury who was calling for help. We heard him clearly. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He remembered Private Johnson, just 18 years old, who had taken shrapnel in his thigh and had been crying out in pain and fear while lying exposed between the two positions. Marcus had tried repeatedly to reach him but had been driven back by sniper fire each time. Johnson had eventually been rescued after dark, but those hours of listening to his calls for help had haunted Marcus for decades. We could have silenced him easily, Nguyen continued. But my sergeant, a man named Duc who had 3 sons of his own, convinced me to order our men to avoid that area. He said the boy was someone's child, and if we could show mercy without compromising our position, we should do so. The photograph Nguyen had produced showed several Vietnamese soldiers in defensive positions. One figure in the background appeared to be gesturing toward a specific area, as if giving instructions about fields of fire. Marcus stared at the image, trying to comprehend the reality that enemy soldiers had chosen to spare his wounded comrade when they could have easily killed him. Johnson made it home, Marcus said quietly. He married his high school sweetheart and raised 4 kids. He owns a hardware store in Minnesota now. Nguyen smiled, the first truly warm expression Marcus had seen from him. That is very good to hear. Duc would have been pleased to know this. He was killed 2 months later in a bombing raid, but he often spoke about making choices that would allow him to face his sons with honor when he returned home. The weight of this revelation settled over Marcus like a physical presence. For nearly 50 years, he had carried the memory of that day as a tale of enemy callousness and American perseverance. The idea that North Vietnamese soldiers had consciously chosen to show mercy, at considerable risk to their own safety, forced him to reconsider everything he thought he understood about that conflict. Sarah appeared at their table, coffee pot in hand. More coffee for either of you? She asked cheerfully, seemingly unaware of the profound conversation taking place. Both men accepted refills, though Marcus suspected neither was really thinking about caffeine at that moment. After Sarah moved on to other tables, they sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The morning sun had shifted position, casting different patterns of light and shadow across their table. The ordinary sounds of the restaurant continued around them, creating an odd backdrop for their extraordinary conversation. Why did you come here? Marcus finally asked. Why seek me out after all these years? Gwyn carefully returned the photographs to his jacket pocket, handling them with the reverence reserved for precious family heirlooms. I am 73 years old. My wife passed away 2 years ago, and our children live in different cities with families of their own. I found myself thinking more and more about the war, about the choices we made and the paths our lives took afterward. He paused to sip his coffee, gathering his thoughts. I began researching what happened to various American units we had encountered. Modern technology makes such research possible in ways that would have been impossible before. When I found information about your restaurant, about your service to veterans in this community, I felt I needed to meet you. Marcus was still processing the implications of everything Gwyn had shared. The narrative he had carried about his Vietnam service was being rewritten with each revelation. Enemy soldiers who had shown mercy, decisions made with consideration for human life even in the midst of combat, acts of restraint that had saved American lives without Marcus ever knowing it had happened. There is something else, Nguyen said, his tone becoming more serious. Something more difficult to discuss. The construction workers were finishing their meal, preparing to return to their job site. Their easy laughter and casual conversation created a strange counterpoint to the gravity of the discussion at the window table. Marcus found himself envying their uncomplicated concerns about weather and work schedules and whether the local football team would have a good season. The night attack on your base camp, April 15th, Nguyen continued. My unit was involved in the initial assault. We penetrated your perimeter near the eastern gate. Marcus felt his body tense involuntarily. That attack had been one of the most terrifying nights of his life. The North Vietnamese had somehow breached their supposedly secure compound, leading to hours of close-quarters fighting in the darkness. 3 Marines had been killed and 8 wounded before the attackers were finally repelled. It had been the kind of battle that left everyone involved questioning their own mortality and the randomness of survival. I know this will be difficult to hear, Nguyen said carefully, but I believe I may have encountered your friend that night. The sergeant with the scar on his chin who was always joking to keep morale up. Marcus knew immediately who Nguyen meant. Sergeant Mike Reynolds, a career Marine from Texas who had a gift for finding humor even in the worst situations. Mike had been killed that night while attempting to rally a defense near the communications bunker. Marcus had found his body the next morning and had helped carry him to the medical station, knowing there was nothing anyone could do for him. I remember him clearly because he continued making jokes even while under fire, Nguyen said, his voice carrying a weight of old grief. He was trying to keep his men calm, and, even in combat, there was something admirable about his courage. When our positions overran that section of your base, he could have surrendered, but he chose to continue fighting to protect his men. The casual mention of his friend's final moments hit Marcus harder than he had expected. Reynolds had been the kind of Marine who made everyone around him feel safer and more confident. His loss had devastated the entire unit, creating a hole in their morale that never quite healed during the remainder of their deployment. He was a good man, Marcus managed to say. The best kind of Marine. Nguyen nodded solemnly. In our tradition, we believe that warriors who die with honor deserve to be remembered with respect, regardless of which side they fought for. Sergeant Reynolds fought with great courage that night. His men were able to fall back and regroup because of his sacrifice. The idea that an enemy soldier had recognized and respected Mike Reynolds' heroism provided an odd form of comfort that Marcus hadn't expected. For decades, he had thought of Mike's death as a senseless waste, a random casualty of a war that often seemed to lack clear purpose or meaning. Hearing that his friend's courage had been witnessed and appreciated by someone from the opposing side somehow added dignity to his sacrifice. I have carried the memory of that night for many years, Nguyen continued. Not with pride, you understand, but with a sense of responsibility. When soldiers die with honor, their stories deserve to be preserved and shared. Marcus found himself studying Nguyen with new appreciation. This man had traveled thousands of miles and spent considerable effort tracking him down, all to share memories that must have been as difficult for him as they were for Marcus. There was something profound about the gesture, something that transcended the old divisions of nationality and ideology. The diner had grown quieter as the lunch hour approached and the morning customers gradually departed. Only a few tables remained occupied, mostly by retirees who had nowhere else to be and appreciated the comfortable atmosphere Marcus had created. The conversation between the two veterans continued in this peaceful setting, with decades of buried memories being carefully excavated and examined in the gentle light filtering through the windows. Marcus excused himself briefly to check on the kitchen and ensure that his lunch preparations were on track. As he moved through the familiar routine of food preparation, his mind struggled to process the remarkable revelations of the morning. Everything about his understanding of the Vietnam War was being challenged and reshaped by this unexpected encounter with a man who had been his enemy but now seemed more like a fellow traveler on a difficult journey. When he returned to the table, Gwyn was studying the wall of veteran photographs again, his attention focused on a particular image that Marcus recognized as a group shot of his Marine unit taken shortly before their final patrol. The men in the photo looked impossibly young, their faces marked by the serious expressions that came from months of combat experience. Several of those Marines, including Mike Reynolds, had not survived to see their 20th birthdays. "Tell me about afterward," Marcus said as he sat down. "What happened to you when the war ended?" Nguyen's expression became more thoughtful, as if he were deciding how much of his personal story to share. "The victory we fought for was not the peace we had imagined. There were many challenges in rebuilding the country, many difficult years when basic necessities were scarce. Like many veterans on both sides, I found that the end of fighting did not mean the end of struggling." He paused to collect his thoughts, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the table surface. "I worked in agricultural development, trying to help restore farmland that had been damaged by bombing and chemical defoliants. It was important work, but also heartbreaking. So much had been destroyed that took decades to repair." Marcus nodded, understanding something about the challenge of finding purpose after military service. His own transition to civilian life had been difficult, marked by periods of depression and isolation that he had only gradually overcome through community involvement and the eventual decision to open the diner. The work of serving others had provided structure and meaning that helped fill the void left by the end of his Marine career. "Did you ever regret it?" Marcus asked. "The war, I mean. The choices you made?" The question hung in the air between them while Nguyen considered his response. Outside the window, Cedar Falls went about its peaceful Tuesday routine. Cars passed slowly down the main street, shopkeepers swept their sidewalks, and children played in a small park visible in the distance. The contrast between this tranquil scene and the violent memories they were discussing felt almost surreal. "Regret is complicated for soldiers," Nguyen finally answered. "I regret the necessity of war, the suffering it caused on all sides, the young lives that were lost. But I cannot regret fighting for what I believed was right, for defending my homeland and my people." "Can you regret serving your country, even in a war that later seemed less clear in its purpose?" The parallel Nguyen drew struck Marcus deeply. He had spent years wrestling with similar questions about his own service, particularly as public opinion about the Vietnam War had evolved and changed. The simple certainties of youth, when right and wrong had seemed clearly defined, had given way to more complex understandings of history, politics, and the human cost of conflict. "I used to think I could have stayed home," Marcus admitted. "Gone to college, avoided the draft, lived a completely different life. But then, I think about the men I served with, the responsibilities we had to each other. It's hard to imagine abandoning that, even knowing what I know now." Nguyen nodded with evident understanding. "The bonds formed in combat are unlike any other human relationship. We fought against each other, but we also fought for our comrades in the same way. That loyalty transcends politics and nationality." Sarah approached their table again, this time bringing menus for the lunch service. "Are you gentlemen planning to eat lunch? We have some excellent specials today." Marcus realized that they had been talking for more than 2 hours without either of them noticing the passage of time. The depth of their conversation had created a bubble of shared memory and reflection that seemed to exist outside normal chronology. He looked to Nguyen, who smiled and nodded his acceptance of the invitation to continue their visit over a meal. "I would like very much to try more of your cooking," Nguyen said. "Perhaps we could share a meal as former soldiers rather than as former enemies." The phrase resonated with Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. The idea of transformation, of relationships that could evolve beyond their origins in conflict, offered a kind of hope that he hadn't realized he needed. They ordered lunch and continued their conversation, moving gradually from war memories to more personal topics about family, work, and the challenges of aging with dignity. Nguyen spoke about his late wife, a teacher who had worked with orphan children after the war. Their marriage had lasted 45 years and produced 3 children who were now successful professionals in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. His pride in their accomplishments was evident, as was his grief at his wife's passing. Marcus shared stories about his own family, his daughter who lived in California with her husband and 2 children, and his son who had followed him into the Marines and was now a colonel stationed in North Carolina. "Your son chose to serve as well?" Nguyen asked with interest. Marcus nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and worry that all military parents experience. He said he wanted to understand what his father had gone through. "I tried to talk him out of it at first, told him he didn't need to prove anything. But he was determined to serve his country in his own way." "And what does he think of your war service?" The question touched on one of Marcus's deepest concerns as a father. "We don't talk about it much. He's seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, so he understands some things about military service that my daughter doesn't. But Vietnam is different. More complicated for his generation to understand." Nguyen considered this thoughtfully. "My children ask me sometimes about the war, but they grew up hearing it called the American War or the Resistance War against America. They see it as ancient history, something their father did before they were born. Perhaps that is healthy for them." Their lunch arrived, and they ate while continuing to share stories about their post-war lives. Marcus learned that Nguyen had become involved in veterans organizations in Vietnam, working to help former soldiers on both sides deal with the lasting effects of combat trauma. He had been part of efforts to locate and properly honor the remains of American servicemen who had been listed as missing in action, work that had brought him into contact with American veterans groups. "That is actually how I learned about you specifically," Nguyen explained. "I was working with a group that was researching unit histories, trying to piece together the full story of various battles and engagements. Your name appeared in several after-action reports, and when I saw that you had opened this restaurant to serve veterans, I felt I needed to meet you." The revelation that their meeting was not entirely coincidental, that Nguyen had specifically sought him out as part of his work with veterans, added another layer of significance to their encounter. Marcus realized that this conversation was part of a larger effort to heal the wounds of war through personal connection and shared understanding. "There are not many opportunities for former enemies to meet as friends," Nguyen continued. "Most of the time, old soldiers die without ever having the chance to see their former opponents as human beings with families and hopes and regrets similar to their own." As they finished their meal, Marcus found himself thinking about the transformative power of their conversation. In the space of a few hours, his understanding of the Vietnam War had been fundamentally altered. The faceless enemy of his memory had been replaced by a specific individual with a name, a history, and a perspective that complemented rather than contradicted his own experience. "What will you do now?" Marcus asked. "Will you return to Vietnam soon?" Nguyen shook his head. "I am planning to stay in America for several more weeks. I have contacts with veterans groups in other states, other meetings arranged with men who served in my area of operations. This conversation with you is part of a larger journey I am taking to understand the war from multiple perspectives." The idea that Nguyen was conducting this sort of personal reconciliation mission across the country struck Marcus as both ambitious and deeply meaningful. He imagined other restaurants, other chance encounters between former enemies, other moments of recognition and understanding that might help heal wounds that had been left untreated for too long. "I hope those conversations go as well as this one has," Marcus said sincerely. "I believe they will," Nguyen replied. "Most veterans, regardless of which side they fought for, share certain fundamental experiences. We understand loss, we appreciate sacrifice, and we know the difference between necessary fighting and senseless violence." As the afternoon wore on, other customers began arriving for lunch. The normal rhythm of the restaurant resumed around them, but Marcus felt as though he was seeing everything through new eyes. The photographs on the walls seemed different now, less like monuments to a distant conflict and more like reminders of shared human experiences that transcended national boundaries. A group of local businessmen took a nearby table, their conversation focused on quarterly reports and market projections. At another table, a young mother fed lunch to her toddler while simultaneously trying to review notes for what appeared to be a college class. The everyday concerns of peaceful civilian life continued around them, providing a stark contrast to the war stories that had dominated their morning conversation. "May I ask you something personal?" Nguyen said as they prepared to conclude their visit. Marcus nodded, curious about what question might follow hours of increasingly personal conversation. "Do you ever dream about the war? About specific moments or people from that time?" The question touched on something Marcus rarely discussed with anyone, including his family. "Yes, sometimes. Usually it's about the men who didn't come home, wondering if I could have made different decisions that might have saved them." "What about you?" "I dream about faces," Nguyen said quietly. "American faces, mostly young men who might have lived different lives if they had been born in a different time or place. I wonder about their families, their plans for the future that never happened." The shared admission of guilt and regret created another moment of connection between them. Marcus realized that the psychological wounds of war were remarkably similar across all cultural and national boundaries. The specific details might differ, but the fundamental human response to violence and loss seemed to be universal. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting longer shadows across the diner, both men seemed to sense that their extraordinary conversation was approaching its natural conclusion. The lunch crowd had come and gone, leaving them once again in the quieter atmosphere that had characterized their morning together. Sarah had refilled their coffee cups multiple times, and Marcus had briefly stepped away to handle the routine tasks of restaurant management, but their focus had remained consistently on the remarkable dialogue unfolding between them. Gwyn reached into his jacket one final time and withdrew a small wooden carving, placing it carefully on the table between them. The object was clearly handmade, depicting a bird in flight with intricate details that spoke of considerable skill and patience. The wood had been polished smooth by handling, suggesting that it was both old and treasured. "I carved this during the war," Nguyen explained, his voice carrying a note of reverence for the small artwork. "During the long periods between battles, when we were hiding in tunnels or waiting in defensive positions, many of us found ways to occupy our hands and minds. Some wrote letters, others played cards. I carved small figures from whatever wood I could find." Marcus examined the carving with appreciation for both its craftsmanship and its significance as a tangible link to that difficult time. The bird's wings were spread wide, captured in a moment of soaring freedom that seemed to represent hope transcending the circumstances of its creation. The level of detail was remarkable, particularly considering it had been created with basic tools under primitive conditions. "This particular piece I made during the weeks after our engagement near Hill 881, Nguyen continued. "The battle where your unit was pinned down in the rain, where we chose to show restraint. I was thinking about the nature of conflict, about how even in war there are moments when human beings can choose compassion over cruelty." The connection between the carving and their shared memory made the small artwork even more meaningful. Marcus understood that he was being offered not just a beautiful object, but a symbol of the larger themes they had been exploring throughout their conversation. The idea that something creative and peaceful could emerge from the midst of violence and conflict seemed to capture the essence of what they had discovered together. "I cannot accept this," Marcus said instinctively, though his reluctance came from appreciation for the gift's value rather than lack of interest. "This belongs to your family, to your children." Nguyen shook his head firmly but kindly. "My children appreciate my war mementos, but they do not fully understand their significance. This carving represents a specific moment of choice, a decision to preserve life rather than take it. You are the only person who can truly understand what it represents because you were there, you were part of that moment." The weight of Nguyen's words settled over Marcus as he realized the profound nature of what was being offered. This was not simply a gift between newfound friends, but a symbolic gesture that acknowledged their shared history and their mutual recognition of the complexity of human behavior under extreme circumstances. The carving represented a bridge between their two perspectives on events that had shaped both of their lives. Marcus accepted the wooden bird with hands that trembled slightly from the emotional significance of the moment. I don't know what to say. This means more than you might realize. I think I understand exactly what it means, Nguyen replied with a gentle smile. That is why I wanted you to have it. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both men processing the emotional weight of their extended conversation and its approaching conclusion. Outside the window, Cedar Falls continued its peaceful afternoon routine, but, inside the diner, two former enemies had created something that transcended their original relationship and pointed toward possibilities for healing and understanding that extended far beyond their personal experience. Will you stay in touch? Marcus asked eventually. I would like to know how the rest of your journey goes, whether you have other conversations like this one. Gwyn produced a small piece of paper with his contact information written in careful English script. I would be honored to maintain our friendship. Perhaps we can continue to share perspectives on our experiences, to help each other understand what those difficult years meant and how they shaped our subsequent lives. Marcus reciprocated with his own contact information, including the diner's phone number and his personal email address. The idea of ongoing communication with Nguyen felt like a natural extension of their conversation, a way to continue exploring the themes they had begun to address. He also realized that their correspondence might serve as a model for other veterans seeking to understand their wartime experiences from different perspectives. As Nguyen prepared to leave, several regular customers entered the diner for early dinner service. Marcus recognized them as members of the local veterans organization who met weekly to discuss community service projects and maintain connections forged through military experience. The timing of their arrival felt almost symbolic, as if the universe were highlighting the importance of veteran camaraderie and mutual support. Before you go, Marcus said, struck by sudden inspiration, I would like you to meet some people. He approached the group of local veterans, men and women who had served in various conflicts from Korea through the recent Middle Eastern deployments. After brief introductions, he explained that Nguyen was a visiting veteran who had served in Vietnam and was interested in learning about American veterans organizations. The response was immediately welcoming, with several of the Americans expressing curiosity about Vietnamese perspectives on their shared conflict. What followed was an impromptu conversation that extended Nguyen's visit by another hour. The local veterans asked thoughtful questions about life in Vietnam after the war, about how Vietnamese society had honored its veterans, and about the similarities and differences between American and Vietnamese military traditions. Nguyen, in turn, shared insights about his country's efforts to care for wounded veterans and preserve the memory of those who had died in service to their nation. Marcus watched this interaction with growing amazement at how naturally the conversation flowed between former enemies who had discovered their common ground as veterans. The political and ideological differences that had once divided them seemed less important than their shared understanding of military service, sacrifice, and the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life after combat experience. One of the American veterans, a woman who had served as a nurse in Iraq, was particularly interested in Nguyen's work with veterans organizations in Vietnam. She shared information about American programs for dealing with post-traumatic stress and asked whether similar resources existed for Vietnamese veterans. The exchange of practical information about veteran care seemed to energize both sides of the conversation. Another veteran, a man who had served in Afghanistan, asked Nguyen about the long-term effects of war on Vietnamese society and how the country had moved forward after decades of conflict. Nguyen's response about the importance of focusing on reconstruction rather than recrimination seemed to resonate with everyone present, particularly those who had served in more recent conflicts that lacked clear resolutions. As the conversation continued, Marcus realized that he was witnessing something historically significant. These were representatives of nations that had once been at war with each other, now sharing experiences and perspectives in a spirit of mutual respect and understanding. The transformation from enemies to colleagues seemed to embody the best possibilities for healing the wounds left by armed conflict. When Nguyen finally prepared to leave, each of the local veterans shook his hand and thanked him for sharing his perspectives. Several exchanged contact information with him, expressing interest in continuing their conversations through email or future visits. The warmth of their farewell suggested that genuine friendships had been formed in the space of a few hours. Marcus walked Nguyen to the door of the diner, carrying with him a sense that this day had been unlike any other in his life. The wooden carving remained in his hands, a tangible reminder of the extraordinary conversation they had shared. As they stood outside the restaurant, both men seemed reluctant to end their time together. "Thank you," Marcus said, though the simple words felt inadequate to express the depth of his gratitude for everything Nguyen had shared with him. "Thank you as well," Nguyen replied. "I have learned as much from you today as I hope you have learned from me. This conversation has given me hope that reconciliation is possible, even between former enemies who have carried their memories for many decades." They shook hands in the traditional manner, but then, Nguyen stepped forward and embraced Marcus in the Vietnamese style of greeting between respected friends. The gesture felt natural and appropriate, a physical symbol of the transformation their relationship had undergone in the course of a single day. After Nguyen departed in a taxi headed for his hotel, Marcus remained standing outside his restaurant for several minutes, processing everything that had happened. The wooden bird carving seemed to radiate warmth in his hands, representing not just a beautiful piece of art but a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilably opposed. When he finally returned inside, the local veterans were still discussing their conversation with Nguyen. Their excitement about the encounter was palpable, and several mentioned that they planned to research Vietnamese veterans organizations to explore possibilities for ongoing dialogue and cooperation. Marcus realized that the seeds of something larger had been planted during this unexpected meeting. That evening, after the diner had closed and the last customer had departed, Marcus sat alone at the table where he and Nguyen had shared their remarkable conversation. He placed the wooden carving in a position of honor next to the cash register, where it would be visible to everyone who entered the restaurant. The small bird seemed to watch over the space with a sense of peaceful vigilance, representing the possibility that even the deepest wounds could be healed through human connection and understanding. Marcus began composing an email to his son, the Marine Colonel, wanting to share the day's extraordinary events with someone who would understand their significance from a military perspective. As he wrote, he found himself thinking about the broader implications of his conversation with Nguyen. If two former enemies could find common ground and mutual respect after 5 decades, what other reconciliations might be possible in a world that often seemed divided by irreconcilable differences? The purple heart medal that had given the diner its name still hung in its frame on the wall, but it now seemed to represent something beyond individual sacrifice and suffering. It had become a symbol of the possibility that wounds could heal, that former enemies could become friends, and that the shared experience of military service could transcend the political and ideological divisions that had once seemed absolute. As Marcus finished his email and prepared to lock up the restaurant for the night, he took one last look at the wooden carving that now occupied a place of honor in his establishment. The bird's outstretched wings seemed to represent not just freedom, but the possibility of rising above the limitations of the past to create something new and hopeful for the future. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new conversations, and new opportunities to serve his community, but it would also carry forward the memory of this extraordinary day when two former enemies had discovered their shared humanity and found a path toward healing that neither had expected when they woke up that morning. The transformation of the Purple Heart Diner from a place that honored the memory of past conflicts to a space that celebrated the possibility of reconciliation and healing felt like a natural evolution of its mission. Marcus understood that his conversation with Nguyen had changed not just his own perspective on the Vietnam War, but had also created a model for how former adversaries might find common ground through honest dialogue and mutual respect. The wooden bird would serve as a permanent reminder of that possibility, inspiring future conversations that might continue the work of healing that had begun with one unexpected visit on a quiet Tuesday morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa.